Hi, and welcome to the School Health Educators Podcast, where we discuss health education and how to best teach health ed in the K through 12 setting. Hi, and welcome to the School Health Educators Podcast. I'm your host, Lori Reichel, and today's episode is focusing on higher level thinking in the classroom setting, as well as allowing students to make mistakes in our classroom. To help out, I asked Diana Laufenberg, who's a speaker on the TED Talk titled How to Learn from Mistakes. And I will admit, I saw this somewhat recently, and I fell in love right away with everything that she spoke about, because I'm a believer of children and youth needing to be challenged to help them grow. And they're so creative if we allow them to have that opportunity to show that creativity and that thinking. So before I continue, I would like Diana to say hello and introduce herself. Thank you so much, Diana, for being here. Would you mind saying hello and giving us a little bit of your background?
Thanks, Lori. So Diana Laufenberg, I am a former social studies educator. I taught for 15 years between Wisconsin, Kansas, Arizona, and Pennsylvania. I taught all grades 6 through 12, specifically in social studies, although I did have one ill-fated year as a part-time art teacher that we won't talk about. But mostly my career has been focused on inquiry from the go. I saw a teacher teach in like 1995 in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and watched her so skillfully use questions in her classroom to get her students to do their own thinking that I was like, this is it. Like, this is the thing that makes most sense for me in a classroom setting, and really did have spent the bulk of my career chasing that kind of high bar with getting students to do their own thinking and feeling like they can take academic risks with their own work. So glad to be here.
Thank you again for being here, Diana. And would you mind explaining your philosophy of helping students think?
So I've been doing some work recently with some schools in South Milwaukee around inquiry-driven social studies units, and we've been actually talking about this, so all K to 5. And one of the things that we've kind of run around in inquiry, you ask a lot about questions, and a lot of what's going on in a lot of the way that I think about thinking has to do with getting kids to ask academically curious questions. Because the teachers will be like, kids ask questions. And I'm like, yes, then we'll ask procedural questions. What do I do next? Is this right? Where does this go? What are the steps? But are they asking academically curious questions? Why does it happen that way? What do you think happens next? How does this interaction affect that? That is the kind of thinking that we want to really move towards with kids versus that low level thinking. And so one of the big issues is getting kids to do their own thinking. Number one, I use a prepositional reference that whenever you feel like you're doing too much to and for kids, rephrase that as, what can I do by and with kids? So
Love that.
Are you exhausted and the kids are not? Then you gotta get the balance under control there. Did you cut out all the circles in kindergarten for your children? Or did you let them work on their fine motor skills and make slightly imperfect circles, but that they're learning the skill and using their brain and using their fine motor skills to get better at it? Sometimes we child-proof some things that we do and remove the kid thinking from the equation out of expediency, out of control, out of ease. It all comes from a place of wanting a good thing. But sometimes when you allow kids to do their own thinking, it gets a little messy.
I love that you said you're working with a school district in Milwaukee, K through 5.
Mm-hmm.
Some people think that, well, that's too young. They can't be challenged to think. And I know I've taught every grade, and I can see it. They want to be challenged at every grade level. And to me, if you do challenge students, that actually lessens classroom management issues.
Correct. It is it is both an educational thought process, but it is also a classroom management tool. When kids are engaged, and even more broadly, when kids know that who they are, what they think, what matters to them has a place to live in a classroom, they invest themselves in that space and want to make it a better community. If they are, and this happens a lot with the older kids, if they know that who they are, what they think, the questions that they have absolutely no room or place in that classroom, they're not invested in that. They will step back and become very passive in that learning environment. And then when kids are acting a fool, they're not invested in shutting it down or, making that better. And so it is both an educational approach, but it has this very specific upside for community building, for collegial relationships between kids, for relationship building all around. For me, it has been, the Swiss Army knife of approaches in a classroom.
Have you run into sometimes when you're working with students or even educators that something will be explained and like a project or something, and they need to see an example? And it's like, well, if I show you an example, that limits your thinking. Like use your
Yeah.
creativity. How do you handle that?
So one of the things, so there's kind of two ways to go about that. I think that there's sometimes for certain things you can use it to get more sophisticated outcomes. So I'll give you an example of where I saw this happen. And it was just because they were public that the kids saw them. It wasn't like I was sharing it as a model, but I used to have in the high school on election day in Philadelphia, the kids had the day off. And I taught government and 11th grade American history, and I would send them to the polls. That was an assignment, just go. And then they had to write up a little bit of what they saw there, like just go, step across the threshold, see the thing, understand what's happening there. I called it their citizenship homework, like, I don't want you to try to do this for the first time when it matters, like go in there and figure it out. And so we do this 1 year and the kids sent back their messages, and I had some interesting things happen the first year. And other kids in the school in the lower grades saw them because kids would push it out on social media or would share them with their friends in younger grades. And then in the second year, when they went out, I started to have kids do full-blown like pieces, like almost journalism pieces when they got there. And then by the third year, I had fully produced reporting in from this, like kids were doing and this was not the assignment. There was no expectation. It was like they were trying to one up the year before. And so there wasn't a ton of creativity for this, but they wanted it to be more and more polished as they saw the previous examples. And so that was just self-driven. I didn't have anything to do with that. So sometimes seeing that generates something that's a little more sophisticated and can be more interesting. When it is truly something creative, I give them a very clear rubric. I give them essential questions. Depending on the age, there may be a checklist of things that need to be there, evidence of X, evidence of Y. But I don't often tell them how to get from A to Z, for the reason you can stifle that. Now, sometimes I would have them get approved for their topic. So a lot of times in these big projects, I would have them fill out a contract, and at the top they'd lay out kind of what their project was. They would talk about what resources they were going to use or if they needed any materials. And then at the bottom, I would always make them write out where they think they're going to stumble. Where do you think you're going to have trouble in this? Is it getting started? Is the middle? Is the end? Do you not work well with others? Do you spin out? You get a good start and then you spin out in the middle. Do you have trouble finishing? Just own it. Like, yourself. Where do you fall apart in these projects, and just own it? And then I would have a little list that I could make sure I was checking in at different points in the project with different kids. And then on the flip side, I would have like a graphic organizer of some of those required areas that they would be like, oh, do I have this? What am I doing for this? And then when a kid needs help, that's what we're using as the map of whether or not they're on track, versus some model they have in their head that if they just replicate it, they can get the A. So I tried to disrupt as much transactional relationships, like I give you this, you give me the A kind of situation, versus here is what the project needs to evidence. Bring your full self to see what your perspective brings to this and what you want to bring to the table. And I would get wildly different things from kids sometimes, and it was fine because the rubric wasn't about length of paper or, it wasn't about word count. It was about, did you answer the essential question? Do you have good sources? Do you show clear reasoning between the position you're taking and what backs it
Mhm.
up? That, it's the academic side versus the procedural side.
And I love that you have rubrics because currently I'm helping some students create rubrics. And I personally love making them. Essential questions, so important to, help students have that higher level thinking, make it a challenging question. I've been very blessed in which a lot of my students had said, they say sometimes say this in a frustrating tone. They'll say that they leave my classroom thinking more than when they came in. I'm like, excellent. That's my job.
Yep.
Um, but how do you handle the failures that would happen in learning? So if there's no concrete, you have to do it this way, there's more flexibility, odds are, quote unquote, failure will happen. So what do you do about that?
So there's let's see. I think her name is Amy Edmondson. I'm going to look up her name while we're talking here. I can do
Sure.
both things. She had a really nice, she's out of Harvard, had done some research on failure. And I really liked how she broke it down. I think she's actually done some subsequent work from the original piece that I referenced. But she talks about failure as being not one thing. Failure, I didn't do anything. That's a failure that's going to be a failure in all versions. Failure, cancer research. Like that has not been successful, but we don't look at the cancer researchers and go, you should just really stop.
Right.
Like, I think we're good here. You failed. Don't do any more work. There is the type of failure that is that highest level where you are reaching beyond the known into realms where it is a high degree that you're not going to get all the way there, but that in order to get all the way there, you have to go through these steps. Another example, although not anywhere near my favorite human in the world, but SpaceX is doing an interesting thing where they're trying to build this rocket that can go into space. The first one, I think, survived less than 10 seconds and blew up, but that 10 seconds was a lot of really important information. The second one that they just shot off at this last week went 80 miles. That is innovation, pushing the envelope, figuring out where the failure of that is instructive. It gives you feedback. It allows you to build. So, is it failure? I didn't do anything. I cheated, which is kind of the one we only talk about,
Okay.
versus I took an academic risk to reach for something beyond what I know I can deliver to try to do something really unique, novel, creative, and interesting. And you have to create, to your point, space for that to be okay. I did a project where the kids were doing, it was a joint project between ELA and history, and the kids were doing the history of any building in their community. So in
Okay.
Philadelphia, there's, over 1 million people, and it's a very, like, when you are from a neighborhood, you are from a neighborhood. And,
Right.
we had kids from, I don't know, like 60 different zip codes, and they would all come into this school in the middle of town, center city, and they would kind of leave a lot of that identity at the door and then become part of the school. And we wanted to still allow them to be like, oh, it's my community. And, like, this is something interesting from where I live, because a lot of the kids didn't go into each other's neighborhoods. And, we thought it would be really interesting. And so kids did all kinds of different things. Some people did the music repository, the Curtis Institute, which is a very famous music building. Some people did the Mutter Museum, which is one of the weirdest museums that exists. It's a museum of medical oddities, and it has a
Okay.
lot of really stuff in it that was close to school, and people were fascinated. Old building. Some people, in north of the community, there's a school that if you walk around it, you can see the different identities of this building over the 200 years it's existed, because it used to be a hospital. It used to, like, these buildings have stories. So we wanted to tell the intersecting story of a building and a person's name on it. So like, who was Curtis of the Curtis Institute? Who was Mutter? And how does his name get on this building? And so and then they could tell the story however they wanted. It could be a video, it could be a podcast, it could be a website, like however you want to do this. And I had this one young lady who was just insistent on doing this church. And I can't even remember the name that was on it, but it was fairly obscure. And I said to her, I think this is going to be really difficult to get to the end on this. Do you want to do this? And she's like, yep. And a couple days in where it was tough, and I said, are you sure you want to do this? She's like, I do. And I'm like, okay. And she did all the things you would want her to do. She did the original research. She involved it was a Catholic church, a bunch of nuns and priests. And she went to like archives, and she did all the things, and it did not yield an outcome that was successful. Like, she couldn't actually do the thing she was supposed to do because the information just wasn't there, which I suspected was going to happen and tried to caution her, but she really wanted to do it anyway. And at the last meeting that we had at check-in, what she chose to do instead of the project like everybody else is she made a project of her process. Her project became, what did I do and how did I do it? Why did it fall short? If I had another month, what would I do? What advice would I offer to somebody else who was doing this? She didn't regret it. She learned a ton. She was doing original research. This is what happens. And I make room for her to adjust the type of project that she's going to do at the end to evidence what she actually learned. It was different than the other kids, but she didn't learn less than them. In fact, because her information was so much more difficult to find, there's a case to be made that she actually learned more than somebody who was able to put together something slick and that looked great. And the rubric bears out. Did you do original research? Did you, she still reported out on what she got. It just wasn't enough to really fill out the full project like the other kids. And then I had another kid that did original research about the hardware store that his family has worked in. It's been there over 100 years. He unearthed a box of photographs that have never seen the light of day. And the owners gave them to him as like, these are some of the pictures that we've had over the years. And these pictures are real old. And he had to figure out how to cite things that were on the internet for the first time when you didn't have a lot of background information about them. And so there's this great little site that exists about this tiny little hardware store that means something to him and his family and the community, and about the family that has run it for 100 years. So it's just about making room. I jokingly say the extent of it is like, your kids need to know you're not coming at them. Like, this isn't a game of gotcha. I want every kid to succeed, and I'm going to set them up for success. And they know that if they don't do the project the way it is supposed to be done, do not clue me in, do not give you any heads up, and show up with a mess at the end, that's a problem. But if they are engaged in the process, they are checking in, they are seeking support, they are getting creative and thoughtful, I'm not going to come at them with a bad grade, because what is the point of that? It just turns kids into right answer machines and kids that are unwilling to take any kind of risk, which is how you grow, to your earliest point. I don't know how you get somebody to be interested in becoming more than they are today unless you give them room to grow academically.
How would you tell a current teacher who is attempting to create this higher level thinking and students making mistakes, yet former educators perhaps didn't do that, didn't provide feedback, didn't even have rubrics perhaps, or if they didn't give feedback to the rubric. So when they come to you, the students are frustrated, in which, well, now you're wanting me to think. And my level of thinking, I like it here because that's kind of like where I've been at. And I can give you a more concrete example. I was told once by some parents, my health education course should be lecture and quiz based. It's like, well, that's not real life, especially for health. Yet that's what other people, or it was games in their classroom, and it wasn't standard based, it wasn't challenging. So what would you say to an educator in that situation?
So with anybody who's starting out with inquiry, so inquiry and failure, I think are hand in hand. If kids aren't asking questions, they're not going to have an attempt at failure. Like
Hmm.
failure then just becomes, I didn't do what the teacher told me, which is the least interesting kind of failure a kid can engage in. The most interesting is that they are thinking for themselves, are trying to reach for something new and interesting, novel, unique, creative, and they miss. Like that's where you want to go. You don't do it in one swing. Now, if you have kids for an entire year, you start out small. There's a great, I often refer to it as a bucket of resources from Harvard Project Zero, called Thinking Routines. Are you familiar with those?
Yes.
Yeah, I use them every day. If this resource ever goes away, I think I would be physically ill. It is one of the best. Um, they're small. These are not big swings. These are not things that are complicated, but they do get kids thinking about their own thinking as a foundational baseline of where you start this work from. You can do what I call small I inquiry things in your classroom to build up to the place where they're going to be um, bigger thinkers and make bigger swings at some critical thought and some in-depth analysis, but they have to start somewhere. And so incorporating these thinking routines into whatever you're doing is part one.
Okay.
Part two is having things in your room that allow kids to be curious on a daily basis. So it might be visuals, graphics, um, something that gets them to ask questions all the time. I did that to start my class every single day. When I taught in Philly, they're like, "Do you just go home and search these things out every night?" Because I had like 180 of these things, and they're visuals and graphics and primary source documents and things that kids' brains want to try to figure out. Their visual puzzles, and they almost can't not ask questions when they see it. Um, so things like that, and there's two good resources there. One is what's going on in this picture from the New York Times Learning Network.
Hmm.
That is a delightful place. They post a picture on Monday. It's weird and random, no caption, and you're supposed to try to figure out what's going on, and they're strange. Like sometimes they're very strange. Most of them are modern and contemporary, but sometimes they pull stuff out of the archives and you're just like, I have no idea what is going on here. But it forces kids to think about what they're seeing. What are the nouns of that image? What are the verbs of that image? Now, what do you think all of that means together when you consider it? It's walking them through a process of how to become academically curious. So things like that are very foundational. And then you can start building up to smaller style projects where you ask them to figure something out and reach a little bit, maybe on a weekly basis. And then you just build over the course of the year. I had to do this work when I got my seventh graders. I taught middle school for almost 10 years and I had them on a 2-year loop. And so when I would get my seventh graders, you kind of just have to start over again. Um, and build them up from the bottom to get them to do their own thinking. And it's work worth doing. It's very tedious in the beginning
Hmm.
of your relationship, but once they have it, it just becomes how they think about things. So you don't have to really revisit it again. Like it's just
Hmm.
there. And then, and if there's a set of questions that you always want kids to revisit, um, I used to do a lot with primary source document analysis, and I would give them a laminated sheet that had, if we're looking at an image, if we're looking at a cartoon, if we're looking at a letter, here are the types of questions. And we would get it out every time. And about, 9 or 10 weeks into the year, they just wouldn't even need to get it out anymore because they now have that set of analysis questions just running through their head when they see a different
Hmm.
kind of resource. And if they forgot, they know that there's a resource to go back to help them, get towards that place. And so there's some just really basic things that you can do that aren't tricky. Like these thinking routines are like this long and they're all on one page. Like this is not a
Hmm.
complex thing. It is just something that takes the priority of speaking and thinking away from the teacher and pushes it onto the kids. And that is that
Hmm.
is the first step. Is you have to stop doing their thinking for them. A lot of teachers ask questions that basically do the thinking for kids and allow them to fill in a word.
Hmm.
That is a form of questioning, but it is not an incredibly effective form of questioning for long-term retention of information. And in health education, you don't have them anywhere near as many minutes or for as much
Hmm.
time as any of the other core areas. And there's a pretty big case to be made that it's one of the most important things that kids
Yeah.
retain information from. And we know that lecture and quiz can get you some short-term knowledge, but it
Hmm.
is often not information that is retained for very long. And so
Hmm.
there's then a simultaneous case to be made that no, I don't have them. Like we had one health class in high school for like a quarter, maybe a semester, I don't remember. That was it. Like
Yep.
I need that information to stick. And in
Hmm.
order for what learning science tells me is that I need some kids who are thinking critically and analyzing information so that they can apply this for the rest of their life. Quiz test doesn't get us there.
I love everything you're saying. I don't know if you're watching my body language when I go up and down, because when you had said the word, it's tedious. That's the word you had said. I actually went down because I know where my students are at in some of my courses from the beginning to the end. It's fantastic. And they are expecting, like, instead of me going over certain things, it is student centered. It's them even practicing their teaching skills, but applying. In health education, we are attempting to have people teach as a skill-based uh, curriculum. So it's decision making, analyzing influences, accessing reliable resources, using effective communication, et cetera, advocating. Um, Yet even to change that paradigm of it's not lecture based, because so many people had that modeled, or even that's how we were trained originally. So we
Right.
have to do that. No, this is how we are now trying to do things, and not because we think it's better. It's research based,
Oh,
lines
completely.
with the standards, it's student centered. And to go from the beginning to the end of the semester and you see the improvement, and then you got to still start all over
Oh, I know.
again.
Yep, it is, the onboarding of that is
Yeah.
interesting. When I taught middle school, I had a loop of multi-age kids, and we did that for 8 years, and so we
Mhm.
looped 8 times, but our kids, we'd only get half as many kids every year, so it was 7th and 8th together, and then
Okay.
the 8th graders would go up to high school, 7th graders would become 8th graders, and we get another half of 7th graders, and what we found over about by the 3rd loop that the 8th graders became incredibly good at onboarding the 7th graders
Uh-huh.
because they were able to model the type of questioning and thinking
Yeah.
and analysis. And our level of sophistication by that 8th loop paled in or was just a sea change from where we started in that first loop to where we got in the last loop because the kids were able to spiral up with us as well, which is so hard when you only have kids for 1 year. It's like,
Mhm.
I put a lot of work in there.
Yeah.
And then the other thing to point out too is that often the thing that we know about learning in other areas we don't apply to a classroom-based situation. And this goes back to the failure idea. Nobody watches 5-year-olds play soccer and thinks, this is awesome. I love it.
Yeah.
I want to watch this all day. Not a single person. They don't like it's messy, it's hard to
Mhm.
watch, and they're not greeting their 5-year-olds, at least I haven't seen it. Don't put it past an American. Greet their 5-year-old and be like, what was that? You think
Mhm.
that was soccer? That looked awful.
Yeah.
We don't do that because we understand that learning something like soccer is going to take years. It's going to take hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of practice. And for a lot of those hours of practice, it's going to look terrible.
Yeah.
And that's fine because that's how we learn. 7-year-olds in the violin, that's
No.
terrible. It's the same, but we make room for that.
Mhm.
We make room for that
Yeah.
in things like that, like football and basketball, and we make room for it to look messy when they're young. And somehow we lose track of the idea
Mhm.
that it's the same for reading and math and health. And all of these things are a progression of skill that they need to get progressively more sophisticated at with practice. But it's going to look bad when you start. And it's okay because that's how we learn how to do something better. And
Right.
adults are petrified of being in that place. Teachers hate to not be the purveyors of perfection and control and
Hmm.
having everything lined up. But when you do that, what you are negating is the capacity for kids to feel like they can make an error and it not be met with disappointment and negativity. It's met with like, oh, that was a good one. Run through that. Let me know how. Let's see. You almost got there. What
Hmm.
were your steps? Show me how you got there. Ooh, you're real close on that one. We don't do that with
Yeah.
reading and math. We stick them in a special class and pretend they're not there because
Yeah.
we don't want anybody to shame them. Like we don't do that with other things that people accept need a rough start, and
Hmm.
that the point of school is to get better, not to be perfect. Growth is the not perfection. And I was a grade grubbing, competitive, obnoxious student, like obnoxious student.
Yeah.
Um, I get it, but it didn't. That isn't where I learned all this. I learned this as a farm kid.
Hmm.
Like
Yeah.
this is the way the farm ran, and we ran a lot of stuff when I was very young. Like my mom one day goes, "You kids did what you were told," and I said, because we were kind of talking about. She goes, older folks, kids these days, and
Hmm.
and I said, "No, mom, you sent us out the door with an end goal. You didn't tell us how to get it done. You did not tell us what to do. You didn't tell us
Hmm.
how to start. You just said,
Yep.
do not come back in here until X." And then we
Hmm.
had to go out there as 10-year-olds,
You
figure
figure
out
it
how to get
out.
all the cows back in, or
Hmm.
figure out how to get water out to the cows, or figure out
Yeah.
how to fix a fence, or some people will say, like, how'd you guys figure that out? I was like, I don't know, necessity. Um, and
Hmm.
kids, but often we sanitize kids' lives from those types of experiences. When my dad was a kid, even when I was a kid, we're really the last generation of it here, at least. Um, you learned a lot of that other thing outside of school.
Hmm.
And so you would have both things happening, because when you went home, it was milking cows and hay bales and problems. It was just like one long problem. And school could be a little bit more orderly and controlled, and you're learning information and then you go apply it in the world. And we really don't have that anymore. So school,
Hmm.
in my mind, needs to shift to bringing more of that experiential, that deep analytical thought inside the classroom with real things, so that you get kids making good health decisions for the rest of their lives, so
Yeah.
that you have kids engaged in real citizenship style activities as an informed person. The list of skills you were going through for health, I'm like, why aren't we just, this is exactly what social studies is. Like, that is
Hmm.
exactly what that is as well, because you can teach
Right.
social studies and make a bunch of tiny little timelines in your classroom, or you can have thinkers be
Yeah.
able to use history to understand the present and to make good decisions. And we don't need more timelines. We
No, we don't.
need some
We don't.
thinkers.
And I appreciate like what you're talking about. I appreciate what you're doing because I know working at the academic level and seeing sadness in some of my students' eyes when they I give recommendations to strengthen and they were anticipating everything was perfect, quote unquote. And I keep on saying, here's the deal. Why would you be in a program to become an educator if you already knew everything and
Right.
you're
Or
supposed
that
to
you
be
were
getting
already
feedback?
perfect at it. Right. Like,
Yeah.
there's a difference between being good at something and being perfect. I had a kid who was
Mhm.
very intelligent, like very intelligent,
Yeah.
and he would self-assess himself, and he would give himself a perfect score. And I would just sit him down sometimes. I'm like, there is nothing that could be better here. Nothing. And he knew it. Like, if I
Hmm.
really pressed him, he could tell me
Yeah.
what he could have done better and what he could still work on. And we would agree that it would still be a very good grade, but it wouldn't be a perfect grade. And
Right.
it took a lot for him. Like, again, this isn't a completion situation. This isn't, I did it, therefore it's perfect. This is, how well did I measure up to the goal, and where can
Hmm.
I continue to refine and get better? I write essential questions with folks a lot as teachers, and they'll be like, "Oh, this is hard." I go, "Yeah, I've been doing it for 20 years. It's still
Hmm.
hard." Like,
Yep.
this is something I will work on for the rest of my life to get better at. Writing. I'm
Mm-hmm.
never done becoming better at that, and it has been a struggle.
Ditto. Mm-hmm.
Be a great writer. I have passed on early, right after the TED Talk, which was 13 years ago at this point in time. It was a long time ago. I had people come to me with book deals, and I was just like, I don't think you understand the level of anxiety that just those words, they're like, no, it'll be all right. And I was like, no, I don't know. Like, I will just feel horrible the whole time. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
know what, and I don't mind writing, but man, it is something that I have to work on for the rest of my life.
Right.
Becoming a better teacher is something you work on for the rest of your life. And if you don't get feedback now, you're not going to accept it when you're in your room and things are going sideways and you actually need somebody to help you sort
Yeah.
out how to get to a better place. You need to be able to understand what that process feels like well before crisis moment with 25 kids losing their mind in your classroom.
Yeah. Diana, if somebody wanted more information or wanted to connect with you, what should they do?
So I run a small nonprofit called Inquiry Schools, and we do a ton of work. I often refer to us as we bring a toolbox to a set of problems with teachers and schools versus us
Mm-hmm.
having solutions for you. And not to put too fine a point on it and be too cliche, but we just bring a lot of questions
Mm-hmm.
to school problems. And so when somebody wants to work with us, they go through inquiryschools.org. I don't think that was in the bio I sent you, but I can put that in there. But
Okay.
basically, it's through there. And then I have a whole network of consultants that work with me as needed based on the type of project that we have. And a lot of them are in progress teachers. I use teachers in classrooms as much as possible to work with other teachers because I think that there is a ton of potential that we lose if we
Mm-hmm.
don't connect people with people in the classroom as much as possible. Myself, I have, in the 10 years I've not been teaching full time, I did 2 long-term sub gigs to remember just how hard the job is. I timed one of those to have COVID hit in the middle of it. So, I got a real
Yeah.
experience with that particular set of challenges. But we do any number of things. We work with districts, we work with single schools, we work with small groups of teachers. It's really about trying to help folks use the kind of toolbox around inquiry to spur kids to think, to be academically curious, and then be able to take academic risks so that they can make new, unique, novel, and creative things in the world.
Wonderful. Well, I thank you so much for talking with me today. And do you have any last words of advice for anybody before we
Um,
end?
yeah, all I'll say is that this work is a progression, and it is not going to be the first day you walk in and say, hey, we're going to do this. It's not magic. Like, this
Mm-hmm.
is not something that just happens the first time you try it. And so it really is something that you just have to commit to and understand that it's your inquiry project to do this with kids. You're going to ask the questions of yourself: what's working, what's not, how do I get better? When you take this on, it becomes your inquiry project. And I anybody who does this work does not go back from it. There is no putting this back in the box after it comes out. Like, there is no other path. So, but I look forward to, if anybody has any further questions or wants to connect over some potential projects or work, I would love to hear from them.
Thank you again and again and again, Diana. And I totally agree with you. Once you open up like to this higher level thinking, it's really challenging to go back because it's fun. It's a lot of work, but it's fun.
It's the right kind of hard.
Yeah. So to our audience, I thank you so much for listening in. And again, connect with Diana. I will make sure that there's a link with her information in the description of today's episode. And please remember, 1, to follow this podcast on your favorite podcast platform, 2, to check out the schoolhealtheducators.org website, and 3, remember that you make a difference, you matter. So please take care of yourself and continue challenging your students. Thanks for listening in. Have a great day.